Hello, my name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I am so happy to welcome you to this event. I am here with Dr. Katie Pierce, who is a full professor in the Department of English here at Mississippi State University, and she is also just now the new Poet Laureate of Mississippi. So Katie, congratulations, and I am so happy that you're here.
Thank you so much.
So we're going to have a conversation about poetry, and Dr. Pierce is going to share some of her poems with us this next hour, but you are also welcome to ask your questions. So if while Katie is discussing poetry or what motivates her, if you would like to be part of that conversation, or if you would like to ask questions of Dr. Pierce, just please put those questions in the comments below this video, and I'll be sure to incorporate them in the conversation. So Katie, again, thank you so much. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Congratulations. What an honor to be the Poet Laureate of Mississippi. So I was just wondering, just to get us started, if you could please tell us what is a Poet Laureate and what will you be doing during your tenure?
Yes, so thank you, and it's a very good question. Like you said, it's a huge honor. I'm just really excited about this role, and it's basically it's an honorary position, and my role is to be an ambassador for poetry in our state. So I feel very passionately that poetry is for everyone. It's something that should be accessible to everyone, something that everyone should feel like they can connect with in some way, that it has meaning for them. And my goal is to connect with people across the state and help them get excited about poetry, especially people who may have thought that poetry wasn't for them or didn't have anything to do with their lives. I also hope to help Mississippians discover poems that resonate for them and help them write their own poems and amplify their own poetic voices. And I'm also very excited to work with young people and to help them discover the joys of poetry early on in their lives so they can kind of carry that with them as they get older.
That's fantastic. I am really excited that you really want to make poetry available for everybody, help everyone see that poetry really is for and about them. Because, like I think many people in the state, I thought poetry was just something that was hard. Poetry is something that's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be hard to understand. It's somehow elite. It's somehow like this high level of literature and words that's not supposed to be easy. So the fact that you're trying to help people connect with it, I think, is great, especially because right now poetry seems to be in season. I would say, so to speak. What is it about poetry that makes it such a meaningful art form? And how would you even define poetry in the first place?
Yeah, those are great questions too. I think you're right. I think poetry is kind of having a moment right now. And I think we have to thank Amanda Gorman for that, the National Youth Poet Laureate, for really bringing poetry into the public eye so powerfully in this last year. I think it was her performance at the inauguration in January. I think it really showed a lot of people who might not have really thought much about poetry, or if they did, thought about it to kind of say, well, this isn't for me, that poetry was something happening right now, something they could really connect with and be moved by. I think, like you were saying, there is this idea out there that poetry is something that is inherently difficult. It's supposed to be difficult, and that it's something kind of long dead and irrelevant, and maybe it's something you're forced to study in middle school, right? But it's something that's very much alive right now and very relevant to our own lives. And I think that we saw that with Amanda Gorman. And I think that she has inspired a lot of people to kind of seek out poetry in other places. So that's been really fun to watch happen as a poet. Um, but in terms of how to define poetry, I mean, that's such a huge question, and it's one that I think every poet thinks about. Poetry is an enormous umbrella. There are so many poems, and there are so many kinds of poems, and poems can look so many different ways, and they can be incredibly concise, and they can be incredibly long, and they can be, hyper formal and incredibly tight, and they can be free verse, and they can be chaotic, and they can use space in all these interesting ways, and they can employ rhyme, or they can not use rhyme at all, or they could use some rhyme, right? They can be intended for performance, or they can be intended for the page. So it's a huge umbrella, and I love that. I love the endless variety of poetry. I think that one thing that all effective poems have in common is that they pay attention. That to me is a real unifying factor of poetry, is that a poem that's going to be a powerful poem pays attention to the world around it and uses language in some kind of compelling way, right? The language is surprising or sharp, it's accurate, it's muscular, it's doing something that surprises us. But beyond that, I think it's such a ginormous umbrella, to use the word ginormous, which I guess I can use as a
You can
poet
do
right now.
whatever you want. You're the authority.
Yeah, that's true. Um, but there are a couple of definitions of poetry that I really love by other poets that I come back to a lot when I try to think about this question. The poet Gwendolyn Brooks said, "Poetry is life distilled." And I really like that idea. I like the use of the word distilled there because I think of poetry as, I mean, it is that in a way. It's a distillation. There's this very, big idea or a big event or, sort of emotional turmoil someone's going through. And a poem is a way to distill that and sort of crystallize it in a way and make it something that we can look at and kind of dive into. So I love that line. I love William Carlos Williams said, "A poem is a small or large machine made of words." And I love that too. I used to not like that one because I resisted the idea of poetry being a machine, which felt very mechanical and, sort of cold to me. But the more I've thought about it as I've gotten older, I think of it as being, a machine is something that it makes things happen, right? It does work. It sort of it moves. And so that I love the idea of a poem as a machine made out of words. It's a built thing that makes other things happen. So that's something that I love. And then my favorite definition of poetry comes from Marianne Moore's poem Poetry. And this is a famous line, but I love it so much. She described poems as imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And that to me is just, I love that. Imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And that, I mean, you can interpret that how you like. For me, it's this idea of, we're building this thing out of imagination. We're creating a thing, we're being creative, we're making something. But at the heart of it is this very real emotion, something very true and concrete that's always sort of at the center of it. So it's this blending of worlds. So I love that line. Also, I find it wonderfully strange and kind of funny and charming. And so I love that too. So those are some of the ways that I think about poetry, what poetry is.
Mhm. I'm so glad you brought up Amanda Gorman and her inauguration poem because I was actually wrote that in my notes as something to ask you about. Because I also found that poem to be incredibly healing. It seemed to, in a time of polarization and division and anger and tension and all these things, she seemed to use this poem to heal what policy and violence and other things, what we would think of as very powerful things, couldn't heal. And that I think really spoke to the power that poetry can have, and how poets can use it to such good effect. And if I could kind of ask a follow-up question, and just a reminder out there, anyone you have questions, please put them in the comments. I'd be delighted to ask Dr. Pierce your questions. But just to follow up on what you were saying with the definition of poetry and things, who can write a poem? Because you said something earlier that like everyone can write a poem, but the poets that we at the Institute for the Humanities and the English department have invited recently as writers in residence have been like Joy Harjo or we were talking to Hanif Abdurraqib a couple months ago. And these are poets who talk about tremendous suffering or who kind of represent the perspective of a group of people who have been hurt or marginalized or prejudiced against. They seem to have such authority in their voice and in their writing. So what gives someone the authority to be a poet? It seems like a huge responsibility in some ways.
Right. And I think, a big part of that is, well, who are you speaking for, right? And I think that each of us can speak for ourselves, for our own lives, right? So everyone has the authority to write about their own life. We are the experts on our own lives. So you know your own life, you know your own circumstances. and the way that you observe the world. I think that, I mean, I'm thinking about Joy Harjo, and she was one of the first poets, first contemporary poets that I ever read when I was in high school. I discovered her work and I was just completely blown away by it because I didn't know any contemporary poets. And so it seems so amazing to me that here is somebody alive right now writing this stuff that just moved me so much. So I mean, I think that in terms of who can become a poet, anyone can. It depends. I mean, what you're writing needs to be something that compels your reader, right? So, and of course, if you're writing about something, every poem needs stakes. Every poem needs to answer that so what question, right? Why do we care about this thing that you're writing about? Why do I care about this thing that I'm reading? And so, a poet who's doing a good job of that is going to find a way to compel a reader. And what I always tell my students is that work is done on the level of detail and on the level of empathetic imagining. And so if you are kind of diving into the language in a way that feels to you accurate and precise and really kind of drilling down to the truth of something, then odds are you are going to compel a reader with whatever it is that you're talking about, that you're describing. Um, so, and of course, that's going to work better for some poems than for others, right? But I think that that's really at the core of it what it's about is paying attention and finding ways to illuminate our lives and our circumstances in ways that feel accurate and in language that is surprising and resonant.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that about observation and being really precise. I had my own experience with poetry in high school, and I wasn't great with poetry in high school. I'm sure many people weren't. And we get out of high school sometimes thinking this is not for me. But when gosh, I was turned down for a job I really wanted 10 years later, and I was really hurt by it. And suddenly a poem that I'd learned in high school that I hadn't thought about in years just popped into my brain. And I wanted to say, yes, that right now, that is what I'm feeling right now. And I think even that's what some of your poems are doing in this particular moment. I'm just going to do a little promotion right here and say this is Danger Days. This is Dr. Pierce's most recent book of poetry. If you happen to be in the Starkville area, I know that the Book Mart and Cafe on Main Street has many copies of this book. It is very much worth picking up. And I initially kind of was started thumbing through it because I thought, oh, I know Katie. These are her poems. I'll see what they're about. And I don't want to say I was surprised because I knew that you were very good at what you do, but it was moving to kind of be like, oh, well, yes, that is what I'm feeling, or that is what I'm worried about right now. There was a way that you had of taking a complex emotion and packaging it and just the right words that was that. So I was wondering, since we're here, since I'm holding up a book of your poems right now, is there a poem that you would like to maybe share with with us, with the folks that are listening?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and maybe I'll start with this poem, "Please Let It Be Aliens," which is in the book. This is a poem. So again, thinking about that question of like, who's writing poems and why are we writing poems? A lot of times for me, poems come from stuff I read, and especially news articles. We're living in a time of, as we know, constant barrage of news, most of it terrible. And so, I think that a lot of us are kind of wrestling with ways to process that and deal with that. And this poem was written, this is a pre-COVID poem, but it could be a during COVID poem too. And it opens with an epigraph, and the epigraph is a quotation from this article in the Washington Post. This was kind of the clickbait headline. And this is the epigraph. It's a solar observatory in New Mexico is evacuated for a week and the FBI is investigating. No one will say why. And when I read that headline, the first thing I thought was, oh God, I really hope it's aliens. Like, please let it be aliens. And then I thought, that's a weird reaction. Like, let's sit with that for a minute and think about why that was my go-to response to this. Um, and so this is a poem about that, about kind of wanting something surprising, something outside of our own sort of the disasters of our own making, wanting something new. And so it's called Please Let It Be Aliens, and it opens with that epigraph. Let it be a silver disk, A foil zeppelin bleeping across the radar, a blot in front of the sun, and then gone. Let the word intergalactic be paired at last with espionage. Let uniformed men stride briskly down long corridors. Let astronomers pace and calculate. Let there be phone calls and code words, an envelope unsealed by trembling hands, and let the light become strange, the radio signals scramble, the dogs whine skyward. Let there be a great silver crack down the sky of our surety, and flames and fear born of wonder. Oh, let it be aliens for once, instead of another threat from our own sad sack planet, a call from
Mhm.
inside the house twist we all see coming. Let us believe, though it seems impossible, that someone still wants to claim us. Someone still thinks our poison green world worth wanting. Thank you.
I'm kind of doing the silent applause here. I'm sure everyone who's listening at home is doing the same thing. Thank you, Katie. Ooh, it's kind of very evocative, especially the way you end it. Please help our planet as much as we're doing, as hard as we're working to try to ruin it in some ways, or create violence or problems or pollution or whatever it is, still make something worth wanting. Because that's interesting. I've noticed in your poetry a lot of times there are these interesting contradictions or these interesting tensions. Like usually in the sci-fi movies, and you referenced a lot of images from like sci-fi stores or movies, walking down corridors or the trembling hands opening the envelope, or the dogs whining, kind of in a foreboding way. And those are usually, oh no, harbingers of doom. Like most sci-fi movies that aren't made for maybe small kids aren't happy endings. And I'm thinking Independence Day was the big sci-fi movie when I was a kid. And that those were the no peace aliens. And yet here you are saying, yes, but I want this. I want this because it will show that somebody wants us, right?
Right, right.
Um, uh, uh, um, so I found that you do that in a lot of what you write about, this kind of tension that you
Yeah.
find that we're experiencing now. I will just say we're starting to get some comments on Facebook, and we have a comment from physicist Angel Tanner, who's an astrophysicist, and she says it wasn't aliens, but it is a nice poem.
Thank you very much. I did follow up on it and discover that it was not aliens, and I was disappointed, but I've worked through it, but thank you.
So when someone is reading your poems, how do you suggest we go about that? Because unlike maybe some of the poets that we have to contend with in high school, and I apologize, high school teachers, you're great. I had great English high school teachers. In fact, I invited one of them to this program. But I think it's kind of a general statement that a lot of kids become frightened of poetry when they're in high school. So when someone is approaching one of your poems, how do you suggest they read it? Because especially if I open up and I'm just gonna kind of open something up to a random poem. So if I just open up and I see, oh wow, it's a bunch of words, no images, maybe not words I'm expecting to see, or maybe not capitalization or punctuation like I'm expecting to see. How do you suggest we get started or we approach this?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question. And I mean, I think, right, there is the sense that sometimes in school, people are taught certain things, but I do want to I want to second you and just say like thank you to all the teachers out there because you are doing the hardest work. So thank you so much. English teachers are the best and we love you and none of us would be where we are without you. So thank you for that. So, but I think that, sometimes I talk to some students in my, especially in my introductory creative writing classes who come in and they're stressed out about poetry. They're really anxious about it because they are thinking that they've got to crack the code, right? That there's a code you've got to crack, and that's if you don't do it, you're wrong and you're never going to get it, and it's not open to you. And if you can't kind of unlock it, then you're shut out forever. So don't even try. So I think the most important first step to enjoying poetry is to take the pressure off of yourself and to start off by just kind of sitting with a poem and letting yourself get pleasure from it. I mean, there's real value, of course, to close readings and to spending time analyzing the poetic devices that a poet has used. Um, but if we approach poetry like an equation that needs to be solved or like an equation that can be solved, then we're doing poetry and its readers a real disservice. Poetry isn't math. It doesn't have a solution. It doesn't have one correct way of approaching it. And that's one of its real pleasures. It's one of the real gifts of poetry, is that it can open for us in a lot of different ways. There's lots of different doors into any poem. So if we can find our own kind of doorway into it, then we're inside it, right? And so then we can kind of walk around and explore it in a way that works for us. One of the best and most instructive reading experiences of my life was when I was in college and I was taking a class where we read The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. And it was the first time I read it. And my teacher said, listen, you're going to read this weekend. Just read it. Don't look anything up. Don't worry about understanding everything. Just don't worry about understanding anything. Just read it. Just read the poem, make notes, underline lines that you like, just sit with it, and then we'll talk about it in class. But for now, just read the poem. And that was the most freeing and I think important way that I could have come to that poem. And it's the way that I approach all poems now. I mean, at least initially, of course, I do spend time with them and I take time, kind of diving in. And yes, I look up a lot of things when I'm reading poems and I do all of that work. But I think it's really important to approach poems, at least initially, as something that can be a source of pleasure, something that can be a source of joy. And to allow the mysteries of a poem, if a poem has those mysteries, to be something exciting, something that we kind of let ourselves sink into, as opposed to feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to crack this code. And if I don't crack the code, then the whole thing is dead to me, right? So, kind of finding ways to allow ourselves to enter the poems. Um, and then once we've done that initial kind of sitting with the poem, then we can start taking our time with it. I think that poems encourage and require slow reading, which is something that we are kind of programmed not to do much of right now. We are consuming so much stuff so quickly. We're consuming social media, we're consuming news constantly. Everything is coming in these quick little sound bites, and a poem doesn't really allow itself to be read that way. At the same time, a poem can be something small and bite-sized that we can kind of take our time with. So it's kind of offering us the best of both worlds, but a poem does ask us to sit with it and to breathe with it and to take our time with it. And we have to kind of get comfortable with the fact that we may not feel like we're fully understanding it on an initial read, and that's okay. It might take us 5 or 6 or 25 reads to kind of go through a poem and feel like we're getting it. Some poems we might come to, like you were just saying, Julia, it might occur to you 10 years later and you think, oh, that that's the thing that's resonating with me now. That happened with me in grad school. We read the book The Branch Will Not Break by the Ohio poet James Wright. And it's a book of very spare, very imagistic poems. And the first time I read it, I thought, I guess, like, I don't really feel like this is working for me. And then I read it again a year later and it changed me. I mean, it just cracked me open for whatever reason. I was just in a different point in my life then. And those poems really, really meant something to me, but they hadn't the first time that I read them. So I think poems ask us to practice patience and ask us to take pleasure in exploration and to take pleasure in not knowing. I think that's something that's really important for us to sit with. It's okay if we don't understand everything right away. We can work toward understanding. And, also we can look up those words that we don't know, right? I tell my students all the time, if you don't know words, hey, we all have phones now. We have the magic of, dictionary.com or whatever right at our fingertips. It's easy enough. You just type in the word and there it is. So that's important too, to kind of take that time and do that work. But I think the initial step is to take that pressure off and allow ourselves to engage with poems as something that can give pleasure and something that asks us to take our time. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing to do that kind of slow reading of a poem.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that even you, our poet laureate, didn't just like always instantly understand every poem you ever read right away, and that, it was
No,
just so evident in things. And that and you said it kind of depended maybe on your life stage. So it sounds to me, listening to you, like reading poetry can also be a really personal experience. And that it can be different for everyone. And I mean, you can have, and here this isn't what you said, but I'm just kind of elucidating that you could probably have two different people read the exact same poem and they could have two completely different experiences with it and even find two different meanings um,
Yeah.
in the poem because I've heard, and I'm not in the business of literature, but I've heard that once something is written or published, it's not the writers anymore, it's the readers. Would you say that that's correct? So that, you know, it's not like I'm trying to guess, oh, geez, what does Katie want me to get out of this? What is Katie trying to tell me here? But it's more of, it becomes your own if you're the reader. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And I think that's a really complex question too, right? I mean, I think that we can't fully divorce the author's intent from what we're like, we can't look at a poem and think, oh, I'd like this poem to be about kangaroos, and therefore now it is, right? And we can't kind of
Right.
just impose meanings on poems. But that being said, yeah, I mean, I think that any artist, you know, kind of knows that once the work is out there for public consumption and hopefully enjoyment, that we're not, you know, the writer is not sitting there with the reader and saying, oh, see this image there. This was, I was thinking about this bird that I saw yesterday when I put that one in the poem. And oh, this references this thing happened when I was like 7, right? We're not doing that. And we know we're not doing that. So yeah, I mean, I think that the reader, it's the reader's job to kind of sit with the poem and to, yes, to consider, you know, why are these choices being made, and to kind of think about the poem in that way. But yeah, ultimately, it is going to be up to the reader. The reader is going to come away with that poem with their own kind of associations and experience with it. And that's one of the wonderful things I think about any kind of writing and about any kind of art. So it's kind of a balancing act, I think.
I think, well, we're starting to get some questions in, and so I'm just going to go ahead, and this is a question that I'm getting right now, and it says, "Whatever happened to the epic poem? Did novels push these aside, or is the novel an evolution of the epic form?"
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean that's a question for a classicist, I guess. But I think that, you know, I think that it's an evolution of the form. I think that you do still see contemporary poets who are working on book length poems. Um, I'm trying to think of an example right now. And of course my mind is blank. Kevin Young, the poet Kevin Young has done this. Um, there are a lot of contemporary poets. I shouldn't say a lot, but there are a number of contemporary poets who are working on sort of the book length poem. They're doing something more narrative in their work. But right, I mean, I think that as any literary genre kind of evolves as it goes, things kind of ebb and flow, right? I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we get back to a resurgence of the epic. But I think, yes, I think in many ways the novel, it was sort of an evolution of that. But I do think that you still see some versions of that now in different contemporary ways. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. Well, uh, maybe now is also a good time for you to share another poem with us.
Sure.
I'd love to hear another one from Danger Days. Um, hear what you're sharing with everyone now.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'll read a poem because another place that a lot of poems start from for me is imagery and language. So I'm just really, really interested in language, in just sort of the spark of language, the energy in words. And so this is a poem that's it's very word heavy, right? It's not a long poem, but it's a poem where I was really trying to pay close attention to language and to playing with language. This is a poem called Entreaty, and it's another poem that kind of gets at the idea of uncertainty. Um, it's a poem about spring, and spring is a season that I have a complicated relationship with. It's a season that to me always feels, as you'll see in the poem, a little bit tentative. I love spring, but it also stresses me out because you never know quite like where it is and where are we in spring and what's going to happen. And so this is a poem about that and about just uncertainty in general, called Entreaty. Dear spring, commit. Burst your bee and bloom, your blaze of blue. Get heady, get frocked, get spun. Enough with your tentative little breaths, your one-day daffodils, one-day dewfrost. Honeysuckle us right to our knees. Wake us with your all-night mockingbirds, your rowdy tree frogs. Gust and dust us. Pollen bomb the Hondas in front halls, but please no more of this considering, this delicate tenderling. Your pale green worries me. Your barely tuliped branches, your slim shoots any sideways look could doom. The truth is, I don't want to think about fragility anymore. I can't handle a blown glass season. Every grass blade and dogwood so wreckable. I'm trying hard to teach the infallibility of nightlights, to ignore the revving of my own fallible heart. Spring, you're not helping. Go all in. Throw your white blossoms into my gutters, flood my garage, mud my new shoes, leave me afternoon streaked and sweating. Vine yourself around me. Hold me to you, tighter.
I love that poem.
Thank
That was one of the that I think that might be one of the first poems of yours that I read. And I think you had me with Pollen Bomb the Hondas.
you.
Because I have a Honda. I've always had a Honda, and boy, does that thing turn green in the springtime.
Yes, yes, that's right. We have a blue Honda and it turns green in the springtime. Yeah, that's exactly the image that I was going for.
Yeah, we know that that effect. And I think that was one of the things where I said, yes, that's exactly what happens. Um, but also I really love how in that poem you're kind of you're evoking in some ways some of the nuisances of spring. Like,
Mhm.
hallways that are muddy and gutters that need to be cleaned out and your car is covered in green powder and all of those things that you're not necessarily evoking cute little crocuses smelling very sweet and little baby birdies tweeting and things like that. You're kind of saying just bring it, with all of the annoyances and nuisances and mud that comes with it, that you'd rather have that than kind of the tiptoeing little bits here and there. um, and I
Yeah.
think you've captured something that a lot of us have been feeling recently with being uncertain where the wind is blowing, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that that poem, right, I mean, it's about spring, but obviously it's also about what spring makes me feel, right? And the anxieties
Right.
that it kind of gives me. Right, which is exactly that. It's that feeling of uncertainty. It's that feeling of God, everything feels tentative. Everything feels fragile and breakable. So I really can't handle it if all these cute little green, buds are coming out on the trees. Like, let's just do it, right? Let's just have like the
Right.
big old flowers out there and just get to that point because I'm too anxious waiting for everything. So, yeah, exactly.
And if I may, I've also noticed this was in the poem you just read, and in several of your other poems, you mentioned nightlights. Um, and that you've got a lot of nightlights going on in your poetry. So I'm kind of guessing that that's a reference to the fact that you have kids and you're worried about the future that is there for them and the kind of world that we live in where we are worried about bad news and bad headlines, and you want to somehow stabilize things.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And that's really funny because I didn't even realize I had a nightlight motif. It's so, I think that all writers run into this. Like, you have certain words or images that you use more than you know you use. And it's only when somebody else says, "Oh, do you know that you do this a lot in your poems?" And you think, "Oh, yeah, oh, yes, I guess I do." So that totally makes sense. But yeah, that's exactly what that is. I think the nightlight for me becomes exactly what you said. It's a way to kind of represent an attempt at stability, an attempt at keeping a world that feels safe, even when outside of that, it may not be that way at all. Absolutely.
Mhm. Do you ever feel, and we're getting some more questions, but if I can just ask a quick follow-up, because I've always been curious about this with writers. I write history, so obviously anytime anyone writes something, they put some of themselves into it. But everything I write's ostensibly about other people. But you're writing very much from your own experiences and your own emotions. And you even have a poem in your book called Pillow Talk. Um, so are there any parts of you that are off limits to being published, or do you ever feel like you're sharing too much, or things, because now there are all of these people that you'll never meet who know these very intimate anxieties that you have.
Yeah. So, right. I do think that and I think every writer, again, makes their own decisions on this. And this is something that I think is really interesting about writing. Um, so, a couple of sort of prongs to answering that question. I think one, and I tell my students this, poetry, doesn't, unlike nonfiction, where you sort of have a contract with the reader and you're saying, this is nonfiction, this is true, I'm telling you something true. Poems, you have more wiggle room, right? So it might be autobiographical. It might not be. You might be writing a persona poem, or you might be, as I do a lot, kind of blurring the lines between autobiography and invention. So a lot of my poems stem from autobiography, but I might replace details with things that seem more interesting to me, right? So if I'm writing about a thing that happened and I talk about the time that, I mean, I don't know, a great blue heron landed, outside, and maybe it was actually just a robin. I'm just making things up, right? Like you can invent things in poetry. You don't have the same kind of contract with the reader. Your allegiance is to that emotional truth, right? But you never said this is true, right? So there is some playing with detail. So I feel like there's always a little bit of a safety buffer there, right? So even if it is totally autobiographical, I can say, well, the speaker of the poem does this
The
thing. The
speaker of
speaker
the
of the poem says this thing, right?
Mm.
Which I appreciate as a poet. Um, but to answer your other question, is anything off limits? Yeah, I mean, I think that the decision that I have made as a writer is that I am careful not to write anything that I think would hurt someone that I care about. So I think that that's for me, kind of where that limit is. But a lot of writers don't draw that line, which is also okay. I mean, I think that every writer has their own lines that they're willing to draw and their own sort of allegiances. So yeah, there are certain things that I won't reveal. I write about my kids a lot, but I also try to be careful not to share things that I think they would be, absolutely mortified if I shared. I think that and as they're getting older, that'll be something that I'm even more careful about. But I do try to do that. Um, but again, it's different for every writer. But yeah, for me, those are some of the guidelines that I have in place for myself.
Speaking of your process and your writing process and what you include, what you don't include, things like that, we have a question here from Stuart Rockoff, who says that he'd like to hear more about your writing process. And he asks, how much writing and revision goes into your work? Saying more with less seems to be central to your work and the art of poetry in general.
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Stuart. Thanks for being here. And yeah, I think that so my poems go through a lot of revision for the most part. I should say they don't, every once in a while you get lucky, right? Every once in a while you write a poem and it's kind of close to where it needs to be. And that's really exciting when that happens. But I think more often than not, that's not the case. More often than not, for me, I'll write a poem, I'll draft a poem, and there'll be something there that I think is worth pursuing. There'll be some kernel of something that's interesting to me, or some question that I'm trying to kind of get at but haven't quite gotten to yet. And so I'll keep working on that poem. And my poems tend to go through a bunch of drafts. I'm a writer who saves each draft as a new number, and I'll save them every time I change anything that feels even a little bit significant. I'll save it as a new numbered draft. And that way, if I think, oh no, I've ruined it, then I can go back 5 drafts before and find that thing that I liked and fix it. But so I'd say most of my poems go through 6, 7, 8, 9 drafts before I get them to a place where I feel like they're ready to send to a trusted friend to read. Um, some of them, I mean, I have some poems that have gone through 30 drafts, I mean, that's kind of the extreme end of things for me, but certainly it's happened. And I've also had poems where I've just had to sit with them for a year or even 2 years before I come back to them and feel like I figured it out.
Mm.
Um, there's another poem in the book called Strategies for Mothers in the Age of the Sage. And it's a poem that went through, I don't know how many drafts, a lot, like definitely at least, I think, 30. Um, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. I had sort of the images I wanted to use, and I had the rough idea of what I wanted to be talking about, but I didn't know the point of view it was going to be written in. It ended up being a second person poem, an address, and I ended up talking to mothers kind of, generally. But that was not how it started. It was initially first person, and then that felt really kind of narrow in a way that wasn't very interesting. And so I was thinking, well, how can I enlarge the scope? It gets back to that so what question. Why does it matter? And so finding a way to kind of open it up became the solution for me. But a lot of times it's about just sitting with a poem and and returning to it and maybe putting it away for a month or a year and then returning to it again. So that's part of my process. And then another part of my process that I've started really loving, the longer I've been writing, is writing toward the problem instead of away from it. So if
Mm,
I'm writing a poem and I think, oh, this isn't working, then if I can identify why it's not working, sometimes writing toward that problem instead of trying to kind of like cover it up is useful. So there's a poem in the book before Danger Days. It's a book called The Tornado is the World. And there's a poem in there called Relevant Details that starts with a failure of memory. I was trying to remember a bar that I'd been to once a long time ago in Austin, Texas that I really liked, and I couldn't remember the name of it. But I wanted to write about it. And so the poem, I decided to start off with my failure of memory and to start riffing on the idea of, well, maybe it was called this, or maybe it was called this, and kind of playing with that. And then having to answer that so what question of why does this matter? Why am I just riffing on this thing? And that took me a while. And finally, the answer was, oh, it's because I'm trying to kind of play with the idea of memory and give myself many options for the way that I kind of choose my own adventures in my memory. But so that poem has a line, you know, this poem has a gimmick and you're right. And sort of just kind of directly addressing kind of the elephant in the room. Like, yeah, I am doing a gimmicky thing. So let's talk about that. And here's why, and kind of moving toward that. And that's been something that's really fun for me to do as a poet, to say, okay, well, I don't know what I'm doing here. So let's go toward that and see what happens when I just acknowledge that to be the case and kind of work with it. So that's really fun as a writer, is to kind of accept, again, with that idea of like, accept that we don't know everything, accept that it's okay to have questions even about our own work, and just kind of see what happens.
so talking to you about your writing process is making me get a little bit excited, um, about possibly writing poetry. And there was a moment right at the start of the semester where there was a lot of uncertainty. Again, this theme is coming up a lot these days. There's a lot of uncertainty about how to handle students, how to handle classes, what was safe for the students, what I was supposed to be doing as a professor, etc. And I kind of had was up in knots, and I'm just like, I need someone to tell me what's going on. I need someone to write a poem about this, because I've been reading your work and I was thinking, where's my poem for this moment? So, if someone is feeling like they are motivated to write a poem, how do you suggest they start? I mean, especially if they, unlike you, they're not a creative writing professor. If they you know, haven't had this fabulous relationship with poetry up to this point, or a huge background in it, where do you recommend we begin as young burgeoning poets who might have something to say and don't know how to get started?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my very favorite things to think about. Um, and so I should say that one of another project that I have as Poet Laureate is I'm writing a monthly column for the Mississippi Books page of the Clarion Ledger. So it comes out once a month. There have been 2 installments so far. I think it runs on the third Sunday of every month, um, in the newspapers, but then it's also on the Mississippi Books page website, so you can find it there if you want to pull it up. And so in that column, I'm calling it Poetry Break, and I'm in each column I'm writing a little bit about poetry, and then I'm providing a prompt, a poem prompt for people to try their own poems, whether they're people who are, just wanting to try it out for the first time, whether they're people who are already writers looking for a way to kind of jumpstart something. And I'm trying to make these prompts things that could be used by people of all ages. So I'm thinking about, grown-ups looking for a break, and I'm thinking about parents desperate for something to do with their 7-year-old on a rainy weekend, and whatever. So I'm trying to make these things that are for everyone. Um, so that's one thing that if you're interested, you could check that out on the Mississippi Books page. It's called Poetry Break. And but one thing about poetry prompts that I love is that they offer us a track to run on. I think it's so helpful to have a track to run on. We're sitting down to write a poem, and I use prompts regularly in my own writing. You can find a million of them out there. If you just Google poetry prompts, you'll find a million good ones. Um, some of my favorite ones are the ones that actually kind of counterintuitively offer limitations. And then I find those limitations really freeing. So there's a great exercise by the poet Rita Dove, who was a United States Poet Laureate some years ago and was also one of our visitors to the Institute for the Humanities a few years back, and she's wonderful. She has an exercise called the 10-minute spill, which you can Google this and find this online too, I think. But it's this great exercise, and I've done it with my students to great effect. And the idea is she gives you 8 words. I think they're like mother, blackberry, whir, cliff. I forget what the other ones are. But anyway, you have 8 words and you have to take an adage, some adage, don't cry over spilt milk or a stitch in 9 saves time or whatever. And you have to change the adage in some way. So change some word about it and use 5 of the 8 words and write a 10-line poem, and you have 10 minutes to do it. And
Ooh,
it's, that 10-minute detail always panics people. And she says in her instructions for this that it's kind of meant to panic you, because everybody knows you can't really write a great poem in 10 minutes. So it takes the pressure off. Your initial impulse is, I can't do that. And then once you think, well, I can't do that, so I guess I'm just going to wing it, right? And so then you end up kind of breaking through to these really surprising ideas, surprising images, surprising connections and bits of language, because you have these parameters that ultimately really kind of free you up. So
mm,
that's one thing that I think is really fun to do, and I've done that in my own writing a bunch. But really, I think it all comes down to paying attention. It all comes down to using words in a way that feels accurate. And it's also about letting your writing get weird, right? I mean, I think that that's so important. I think that you can't write anything if you're starting from a point of self censorship, right? You have to be able to give yourself permission to write the stuff that is going to not make a lot of sense at first, or maybe just sound a little strange when it gets going. And you can always revise later if you want to, or you can keep that wonderful weird energy, which is one of the real perks of poetry too, I think. But so finding ways to be accurate. I think the first prompt that I did for this poetry break column was about using the senses to describe a month, and it was about the month of July. And so it was, to say, okay, what does July taste like to me? What does July smell like to me? And to combine both kind of positive and negative things and see what you come up with. And it's such a sort of simple and straightforward thing. But again, if you're paying attention, if you're being accurate, you're probably going to come up with some really interesting and surprising stuff. And again, important to keep in mind that everybody's experience of everything is different, right? So my experience of July is going to be very different from your experience of July, right? So to kind of think about, what is the taste you associate with it? What is the smell you associate with it? What is kind of the feeling on your skin that you associate with it? To use those senses and to kind of dive into the sensory world that way, it's a way to automatically kind of get us to a place of observation and of sort of compelling detail. So it's a great jumping off point. And then, of course, from there, you can spin off into whatever you want. The prompt that I had a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was just last week, time is kind of, I don't really know what time is
time
anymore.
is
It's
weird
definitely
these days. Yeah.
but it had to do getting again to that idea of uncertainty and sitting with these questions. It was about writing a poem that comes from questions, to make a list of questions that you have. Not every poem needs to answer a question. Poems don't need to necessarily offer us solutions. Sometimes it's enough to just ask the questions and to ask your readers to ask the questions and to just kind of sit with that, not knowing. So to make a poem out of questions can be a really satisfying thing to do. I don't understand this. I don't know about this. Why is this thing happening? And again, to be as specific as you can, to use details, but to let yourself write from this point of questioning and not being sure and not understanding can be also kind of a really powerful way to start a poem. And then, from there, you decide what you want to do. Do you want to keep your poem entirely comprised of questions? Do you want to kind of spin off from one question and kind of dive into that? Do you want to have some things you don't know and some things you do know? Endless variety is possible. But there's lots of fun ways to approach writing poems. So, but I would urge people to seek out prompts because they're wonderful ways to get started, and also just to read. If you can read poems that you enjoy, they'll often kind of trigger they'll trigger kind of associative bits of language for us. They'll spark memories, and all those things are great ways for us to get into writing our own poems.
This is fantastic advice, and I love that you're suggesting prompts, and I love that you are providing us with prompts. I mean, I just wrote down on like my to-do list, get Clarion Ledger prompts. Because what a fun thing to do is like, what are the census for July? And it's not something I would have ever paid attention to, without your suggestions. And so one of the things I've heard a lot about, in terms of how people are trying to deal with some of the difficulties we're all experiencing right now is to, kind of be aware of your surroundings and to just take your time and appreciate the little bits and pieces that are there, like be in the moment. And what you're describing sounds very similar to just be very, very aware of what am I feeling right now? What am I smelling right now? What does this moment comprise of? And I have found after reading poetry that when I go outside to take a walk, I feel the sun a bit more intently. And I'm looking for things. I'm looking for color or things like that. So it sounds like writing poetry isn't just going to be about practicing your vocabulary or getting words on a page. It's also kind of about having a deeper experience with wherever you are, right now. Speaking of connecting with people though, and how you're trying to connect people with poetry, we have a question here from Coleman Warner at the Max Arts Museum in Meridian, and he's got a question for you. He says, "We sometimes must work hard to attract visitors who have little personal history with museums. Do you not face this in your reach as poet, especially in Mississippi? And how do you break through?"
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yes, I mean, I think that is absolutely something that I think about a lot. And I think about that a lot as a professor. I mean, that's something that I see people come into my introductory creative writing class and, they're thinking, I mean, I have them, right? They have to be there. So, I mean, in a way
There's
that
a
works
grade
in my
involved.
yeah, I mean, they can't just I mean, they could just get up and leave, I guess, but, they're there. They're kind of a captive audience in that way. But yeah, I mean, I it's funny, even way before the Poet Laureate appointment, I have thought about being an ambassador for poetry. I mean, I think that a lot of poets feel all the time like we're ambassadors for the art form because for that exact same reason, people maybe don't seek it out or it's not something that they feel like they are interested in or that they have access to. But what I found, and I'm sure that this is a similar thing maybe with the art museum, is that once people are there, once they're sort of hearing poems or getting the experience of writing them or reading contemporary poems, they're thinking, oh, it's not what I thought, right? So I so frequently have students who are saying, wow, I didn't know that poems didn't have to rhyme. I didn't know that poems could be funny. I didn't know that poems could be about contemporary things. I didn't know that poems could, use swear words. I didn't know that that I could do this stuff in poetry. Um, so it's such a joy to work with students and to help them see, yeah, this is something that's relevant to your life. Um, but having people in class helps with that. So I think that one of the big questions for me in this role as poet laureate is how can I do the outreach to people who are not, kind of a captive audience in a classroom? How can I reach out to people outside of that? And I think for me, a big part of the answer is going to be bringing it to them. Because I think you're right. I think that people are not necessarily going to seek this out as much as we might desperately want them to. But I think that it's a matter of kind of bringing it to them. So I'm hoping to be able to work a lot with kids in the public schools in Mississippi, and kind of work with students. I've been talking with the Library Commission about doing poetry walks, kind of getting things set up at libraries across the state where people can kind of be outside and read poems as they walk. Um, the Clarion Ledger column is part of that, and I'm brainstorming other ways right now that I can try to kind of bring it to people. But I think that's really that's at the heart of this, I think, is right. Most people aren't going to seek out poems. I hope that I can change that in some way. I hope that maybe some people will start to seek them out more. But in the meantime, or in lieu of that, I'm looking for ways that I can bring poems to other people. And I think for me, a lot of that starts with young people, because I think that if people experience when they're children that poems can be things that are fun and transformative and things that they can do, I think that carries forward. So that hopefully when those students get to my college classroom, 10 years later, they're excited about it. They know that, okay, yeah, this is something that I can do. Or even if they're not excited about it, maybe at least they're not afraid of it, right? It's something that
Right.
they have some familiarity with, and they think, yeah, this is something that I have access to this. This is something that that matters to my life and that I have a connection to somehow. So, but yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think for anybody who works in the arts, and it's something that I think we're all wrestling with regularly.
Right. And one of the neat things about poetry that I've found anyway is someone who's also not a poet but has written poetry. And I put this in little quotes because I'm
No,
sure it's not
of
any
course,
good, et
sure.
cetera, et cetera. But I think there are lots of people who play with poetry. I even used to go to a coffee shop in Washington, D.C. every morning before I went to an archive that I was going to. And because I was a regular, I was, always chatting with the guy behind the counter, and he was a poet and he was really proud of it, and he would send me his poems and they all rhymed and they were very different from your poems, and it didn't look like he was trying to make it his new day job, but he just loved being able to kind of pour himself out that way. And I think that's very different than, say, people who play in orchestras, or people who are opera singers, or people who, maybe are painters and have taken years and years and years and years and years of practice and conservatory and things to get to a point in that art form. Whereas poetry, you really can, and I'm not in any way trying to diminish all of the hard work of people who've become professional poets or are like you, Katie. But poetry is a thing where I think you can kind of enter it and make really good use of it and have something worth saying in it. And I think that's something that one can find in poetry very quickly and almost conveniently that you don't find with other art forms, because reading a novel is a bit of a commitment. And reading a novel is a great way to experience other people's lives, or try out other perspectives, or find paths of empathy and things like that. But, all due respect to novelists, it's a bit of a commitment to read a novel. Whereas a poem, even if you do sit with it for a while or come back to it a couple times, it's something where you can kind of get a new, hmm, within a few minutes even. And I think that can be very important, especially in a place like Mississippi, where I think there are a lot of students. You're talking about reaching out to students. A lot of teachers are struggling because literacy is very difficult right now for students. Reading is not as apparent as it used to be in our culture. And so a lot of students are struggling with reading and writing and keeping up with the levels they're supposed to be in their school systems. But, poetry, because it is so open and because it has so many possibilities, is a point of entry
Yeah.
um, into literacy and into experiencing the lives of other people who are not like you,
Yes.
which seems to be so crucial. So I wish you a lot of luck in your work, and I hope you are able to touch a lot of people and show them, look, yes, you have something to say and people want to listen.
Thank you.
We only have a few minutes left, and so I'm just gonna ask one more question, if I might. You've mentioned in our conversation Amanda Gorman and Rita Dove and a few other poets. If someone is kind of interested in expanding their poetry knowledge, or wants to really dive in, or is really enthusiastic after hearing you describe things, what are some poets you'd recommend to folks?
So, I mean, this is such a, it seems like it should be the easiest question in the world, but there are so many poets that I love that I find this to be a really hard question whenever I get it. So, but I think that thinking about people that, if someone's interested in coming to poetry and kind of exploring it more, I think about the poets that I have taught a lot in my classes, because I think in my classes, I often have students who are doing just that, who have said, "Wow, this is an art form that I want to pursue. This is something that I want to study more and dive into more." But they may not be coming to it with, a super elaborate background in it, right? So things are kind of new. So I'm thinking about poets whose work I think is absolutely incredible and who I also think can really resonate with readers. Poets who I love teaching the work of Amy Nizuka Matadel, who is also a Mississippi poet. She teaches at the University of Mississippi, and she actually read for Mississippi State last fall through the Price Caldwell Visiting Writers Series. She's amazing. She has several books, but her book Oceanic is the most recent one, and it's really beautiful, and it's a great example of ways that you can draw from other fields of knowledge. So she's a poet, she's an English professor, but she's drawing a lot on science, particularly marine science, in writing her poems. So That's a great book.
Humanities and STEM. I really like it. And everyone who's listening, we'll put the names of these poets in the comments after this is over. So don't worry about frantically trying to write it down or find the right spelling. We'll get it there for you.
Perfect. But Amy Nizukuma is one that I teach a lot. I teach the poet Marcus Wicker, who teaches up in Memphis. He has two books of poetry. His most recent one is called Silencer. The one before that is called Maybe the Saddest Thing. He draws a lot on pop culture and current events and writes about race and writes about sort of contemporary America. And he's just a really powerful poet. The poet Maggie Smith, whose most recent book is Goldenrod, is she wrote the poem Good Bones that a lot of people are familiar with, went viral a few years ago. So I love when poems go viral. It's very exciting. So she's really fantastic. Matthew Olsman is a poet whose work is really wonderful and sort of simultaneously funny and heartbreaking. He's somebody whose work I really love. Camille Dungy writes a lot about climate change, climate crisis, and also kind of about the beauty of the world. And then I return a lot to Frank O'Hara, the poet Frank O'Hara, if we're going further back in time. Lucille Clifton is somebody else who I find just tremendously powerful as a writer, but whose work you can also kind of access, I think, pretty quickly. So, I mean, I could keep going forever, but that's a good it's a good starter list there. They're all incredible poets. So you do well to read any of them.
That's fantastic. And just hopefully just to kind of highlight a lot of the themes and things we've been talking about. I will just say that one of my favorite poets is Emily Dickinson. And she's one of those poets where I didn't understand her very well at first. And then as I've aged and hit certain points, all of a sudden phrases will resonate with me. And she's also a great poet for the pandemic because she wrote mostly about her backyard. And for some of us, that's about the extent to which we can travel right now. So she's a great poet for that. But there's a certain, I found a wonderful poem online recently. This might be one of those viral poems that you're talking about, because one of Emily Dickinson's very famous poem is called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. And she kind of describes hope as the form of a bird, and it's a thing with feathers, and it perches on your soul, and it never asks a crumb, for all that it gives you and things. It's kind of a very typical Emily Dickinson poem. And there was a response to that poem. I love it when poets respond to other poets in poetry. There was a response to that poem called Hope is Not a Bird, Emily, It's a Sewer Rat. And then there's a poem which follows that. You're nodding, so I'm guessing you're familiar with it. But I think that kind of speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about, is that yes, you can kind of have this very kind of high end poetry, but also you can have kind of a very visceral, immediate kind of response to it. And you don't have to come from some elite moment in order to have that response, that where you are and that perspective you have to share in that moment is valuable and is worth being poetic, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. And I also love the idea of poets talking to other poets, right? And kind of being in conversation, especially kind of across the years. And I mean, it's a wonderful thing. So yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, all kinds of possibilities there. Katie, thank you so much for talking to me today. Thank you so much for talking to everyone out there. Again, congratulations on Poet Laureate. Since you are at Mississippi State, I hope that you can combine again with the Institute for Humanities to do maybe a few other programs. If you're looking for outreach opportunities, I have some ideas. But I'm sure everyone is going to be really interested to see all the state of Mississippi become more involved in poetry and more poetic during your tenure as a Poet Laureate. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Julia.
All right. Bye-bye.